The sound of skin on skin stopped a room of 400 people mid-symphony. It cut through the string quartet and the clink of crystal as though someone had taken a blade to the air itself. For a moment, there was nothing but that single obscene note. The slap, hard and alive, the world reduced to its aftershock. Josephine's hand flew to her cheek. A smear of red glistened on her porcelain skin like a blot on an otherwise immaculate painting. A champagne flute hit the marble floor and exploded into a meteor shower of glass. The chandeliers kept burning as if they could not see what had happened beneath them. Their light made the blood on her fingers look almost jewel-like. Around us, faces blurred into a single question. Why? André did not move. He stood at the head table, his tux still immaculate, his boutonniere trembling on his lapel, looking past his wife as if the room had become an exhibit behind glass. He had been taught to speak in polished lines, to avoid anything that would disturb a carefully calibrated image. Tonight, in front of his friends and both families in a stage set that had cost more than most people's houses, he chose the only thing more violent than a slap. Silence. Sutton, thin, very young in ways that made you think of sugar and glass, looked like a woman who had just swallowed a lie and found it bitter. Her cheeks were damp with tears that had the rhetorical sound of a performance. Her palm was still open as if she expected someone to tell her she had misjudged her force. For a second I saw, with the terrible clarity that only comes to you when something essential breaks, that she had meant for those hands to mark my Josephine, not merely to sting, but to humiliate. I will tell you what you must know first. Josephine and I had been married 50 years. We had walked through poverty and profit together, through rooms with bare bulbs, and rooms like this one with gilded edges, and too many waiters. She was 50 years of conversation sitting beneath a silk dress. She was my steadying hand in markets where men traded fortunes like baseball cards. She was the one who could stop me from doing something foolish simply by touching my arm in the middle of a meeting and raising a single eyebrow. There are many ways to build an empire. There are fewer ways worth keeping it. We kept one another. I have never enjoyed spectacle. Power, in my practice, was a thing exercised with restraint, strategic, surgical, unseen until it is too late to ask why it was done. That evening I felt the old muscle twitch, but fury does not serve when you have been responsible for building something that must survive you. Fury makes noise. Strategy wins. So I inhaled what I will admit was a personal, private rage, and I watched. Lock down the east doors, I said to Marcus, who had been my venue manager for 12 years and treated the property as if it were his own. He nodded, a man of the practical temperament that suits the people who keep important things functioning. Marcus moved through the ballroom like someone in a choreography he had practiced 100 times. He closed a corridor, shepherded a few guests aside, and signaled security to block the service entrance. Get me every angle, I added. Every camera. It is important you understand that the first act of our response was not a tantrum, it was chain of evidence thinking. A slap is an act, and in an age of phones and CCTV, nearly everything becomes a record. The cameras over the dance floor, the discreet feed in the bridal suite hallway. The phone footage a bridesmaid had already uploaded to her story. Those small squares of light would tell the story that my son refused to tell. I had invested in the right kind of watchfulness long before any of this, because you do not become what I became without learning that reputations are fragile and that people will try to rewrite what they do when the lights are off. Josephine steadied herself. Her hand trembled, but she put her chin up and looked at me, not pleading but waiting for instruction. She has dignity. She has always kept it as a shield and a weapon. In that look I felt something die quietly inside me. Not Josephine, she was as resolute as ever, but the idea of my son as a guardian, as the heir of what we had built. He failed in a single indelible second. We moved as we always did, quietly, precisely. Marcus wrapped the broken glass in linen and set the shards aside for the venue's records. The maître d' took down the floral arrangements, and the attendants began shielding the elderly from the press of bodies. Someone called for towels. I asked for a simple linen handkerchief, white, heavy. When Josephine pressed it to her cheek, the fabric took on the story of the night. Hands again, the gesture of wiping, of steadiness, of the signature move of the life we had constructed together. I instructed Marcus to put every surveillance feed on a secured drive and to hand it to me. His hands, big, competent, were steady. On principle, we did not broadcast the footage. We kept it in the same way a chess player keeps a move in hand. We would not be pushed into the ugly theater of accusation without our record. I had always preferred to wait until the facts aligned to make an irrefutable case. That patience had won me more than one battle. At the hospital, the ER was fluorescent and smelled of antiseptic and citrus. The halogen lamps put Josephine's cheek into ridiculous clinical detail. A crescent bruise already forming, a small laceration at the junction of cheek and ear. The nurse wrote with a brisk urgency. The doctor moved with a steady competence. They treated her and took photographs, the kind of forensic photos that do not flatter, that do not soften. They recorded everything in the chart: mechanism of injury, timeline, witness statements when possible. We insisted on a full documentation, because we were not going to let a narrative be spun from absence. The ER report was more than a paper. It was a pivot point. It would say, in medical terms, precisely what the room had only felt in its bones. "We'll need the copies," I told the triage nurse. "Chain of custody for any photos will have to be preserved." She nodded. Her eyes registered only the practical. Signatures, timestamps, a doctor's stamp. The world of emergency medicine is unforgiving in its exactitude. It is where gestures meet paperwork and both carry weight. When the attending physician, a woman with a voice that had learned to be firm without being cruel, read back the findings, I felt an odd relief. There are moments when the law, medicine, and technology come together in a way that memory alone cannot stand against. Tonight was one of those moments. We left the ER with a battered paper folder in my hand. In it were the photographs, the doctor's notes, an official charting of the physical injury. Later, a copy would be certified and entered into court files. For now, it sat in the crook of my elbow like a cold thing that promised consequence. We returned to the ballroom because the scene is always the first witness, and because I wanted to see the faces of those who had watched unfold. Guests clustered in small islands, some in hushed, confused conversation, others with the quick, opportunistic curiosity of the wealthy when drama breaches their circle. The bridesmaids had braided their hair back as if expecting a performance. The sound system had been turned down to a murmur. There was a humming tension in the air like before a storm. Sutton had not left. She sat with her parents, Richard and Evelyn, on a raised banquette as if perched at a throne. Their faces were masks of old-money composure that cracked into something less refined when they thought they were unobserved. Richard's hand trembled on the stem of his flute. Evelyn watched my wife with a hard, measured gaze. The old-money instinct is to recalibrate the scene, to preserve the family's image. They are practiced at cover and spin because they have always had networks willing to support their versions. You could see their calculation, how best to weaponize social standing to blunt an awkward truth. Andre finally moved then, but not to protect his wife. He moved to stand by Sutton, an automatic gesture that read like a scripted reassurance. I support her. But one that, in its very predictability, revealed him more than he intended. He produced a polite public face and in that act sealed his fate. The young are often given one lesson too few about what loyalty truly requires. He had been spared the hard forging of responsibility. His response that night revealed the cost. If you're hearing this and wondering what you would have done in that place, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what you think you would have done. I want to know how you measure courage. That choice not to act, that blank space where a father's defense should have been, was as loud as the slap. In it, I felt the collapse of a trust no legal document could ever fully codify. The human trust between parent and child. And perhaps worse, in that second I realized what we had built might be just one generation away from being misinterpreted, mishandled, lost, not through market miscalculation, but through moral negligence. We had not built our protections on sentimental trust. Long ago, when I had first wed my capital to Josephine's steady common sense, I knew that wealth attracts a certain kind of hunger that is not always love. That knowledge is what led us to create a structure that could and would act if someone's behavior threatened the grantor's in tangible ways. There was a document titled simply the Langston-Josephine Family Trust, and inside it was a clause we had not spoken of at every dinner table, but which had always been present in the fabric of our estate planning. Section 8. A morality clause that disinherits a beneficiary upon documented physical or psychological harm to the grantors. It was written in sober, careful language. The trustees were empowered to withhold or redirect distributions where the beneficiary's conduct had caused or was likely to cause demonstrable harm to the grantor's physical or psychological well-being. We had drafted it with Mr. Caldwell, our counsel, those long, late meetings where legal words are hammered into instruments of protection. That clause had always felt like a kind of cold prudence, a line in the sand should someone cross it. Verify legal. We were not lawyers in practice. We were people who knew how to prepare. The trust was discretionary. Trustees had the authority to interpret clauses, to decide what distributions would be made. Josephine and I had not signed it under the excitement of possibility, but under the slow, steady logic of stewardship. Our wealth was never meant to be an entitlement. It was meant to sustain purposes. It was a philosophy in legal form. I am careful in telling you this because legal instruments can be misunderstood. A morality clause is not a blunt instrument used at whim. It is a protection that required careful, documented evidence, medical reports, witness statements, demonstrative surveillance. That is why the ER report mattered so much. That is why Marcus had secured every camera. I was not invoking vengeance. I was preparing to safeguard the dignity and security of the two people at the center of this night, Josephine and myself. The first questions in actions like these are always small and practical. Who has footage? Who witnessed what? How do we ensure the chain of custody of the evidence we will need? Marcus delivered the camera drives personally to my study that night. He was methodical. Every file named and time-stamped, the cameras from the dance floor marked as DF1, DF2, and the hallway cams as HS1, HS2. I have always liked order. In my line of work, order is the difference between control and chaos. That night, as we catalogued the footage, a bridesmaid's phone sent a message in the corner of my eye. A video clip had been posted. It was Sutton, in tears, breathless, her voice a trembling contrivance. They assaulted me, they attacked me. A blur of Josephine's profile, the champagne glass on the floor, and then a cut to Sutton's face. The caption she chose would be repeated in headlines and in late-night feeds. We were attacked at our own wedding. It is a curious thing about modern disgrace. The first image to reach you is often the one that will live in the memory of the vast, fickle public. A filmed accusation can travel faster than an ER report can be certified. The video began to accumulate likes, then comments, then private messages from people I had never met offering condolence and counsel. The platform obliged the performance. The algorithm rewarded emotion, not evidence. We had anticipated this. That anticipation is not cruelty. It is realism. Public narratives form like small storms. They must be met with proof, not with fury. The ER report spoke facts. The footage spoke fact. The small, damning thing that would, if gathered properly, undo the spun narrative, lay in the 3 pieces clasped in my hand and my briefcase that night. The surveillance files, the ER documentation, and, if we could find it, the private communications that showed intent and coordination. There was, of course, a gamble in those private messages on my radar. Sutton and a groomsman named Spencer had been visible in the frames of the pre-wedding preparations, whispering in corners, sharing quick, furtive smiles that meant nothing until someone later looked at phone logs and found a pattern. It is a terrible thing to have to peer into the secret chambers of people you have invited into your family, but it is necessary. If a violent act is to be shown as spontaneous, that is often the work of careful coordination. I held the surveillance drive like a key that night and watched as the first day unfolded into a longer, colder night. The viral clip put Sutton at the center of a sympathetic narrative. Social media is merciful to those who play wounded. Richard and Evelyn, her parents, circulated a version of the story. Their daughter had been assaulted by an older woman. The narrative tiptoeing around what had actually happened on polished floors and beneath bright chandeliers. Their friends called. Journalists began to think in terms of pithy headlines rather than subtle facts. Andre, meanwhile, withdrew into the safety of a public pronouncement delivered by a family spokesman. He loves his wife. It was a tidy phrase for a man who could not look me in the eye. It was an abdication dressed in a line that would later be dissected in depositions for what it was. The choice to protect a partner's image over a mother's well-being. That silence, the abandonment, was its own wound. There is a particular grief that comes with a child's failure to defend what you taught them to cherish. It is not only personal. For someone who has spent a life teaching by example, it is doctrinal. The principle I taught was that privilege carries obligation, not immunity. Andre's posture that night taught me that lessons can be unlearned if you do not guard the books. We did not reply with invective. We replied with documentation. The cameras gave us a sequence. The ER gave us a stamp. Marcus found in a security dump a fragment of a text thread with a timestamp that put Spencer on the phone at the same time. It could be nothing, or it could be everything. I directed Marcus to make careful copies and to keep the originals under lock. We would, at the first lawful opportunity, hand everything to the proper channels. There is clarity and power in allowing others, police, lawyers, medical professionals, to do their work when you have the goods. The appearance of impropriety is a hazard one cannot afford. Walking back to the car that night, Josephine was quiet. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. "We will do what is necessary," she said. "But I will not watch my grandson, if he insists on that side of life, inherit everything we built if he will not protect it." That was a small sentence heavy with consequence. She had the moral clarity of someone who knows that objects are only as valuable as the hands that keep them honest. There was a long, cold ride home with the city lights sliding past, and by morning a smear campaign had begun. Sutton's original clip had been spliced with bits of candlelight and music to make a story more cinematic than truthful. Her parents had hired a crisis PR firm before daybreak. Internet personalities had posted reaction videos with urgent thumbs and fake empathy. It is a peculiar cruelty of our age that you can be shamed before the facts have been permitted to breathe. I will not pretend it did not sting. It cut in places where money guards you poorly, your wife's reputation, your child's character, the memory of a life. But my reaction was not to strike back in kind. It was to ensure that, when accusation met evidence, evidence would be heavier and louder and more precise. There are nights when a man realizes that his life's work must be protected, not just for himself, but for the many people who depend on it. Employees who have paid mortgages with their wages, children who work for a living and who do not deserve to have their futures toyed with by ego or entitlement. Communities expecting the charitable work you pledged. That realization is not prideful. It is managerial. It is one more reason I had invested in contingency. To prevent the story of one night from turning into a calamity that swallowed the good we had done. Before the sun set on that first 24 hours, the story had taken shape into two competing narratives. The viral clip that played to sympathetic audiences, and the cold fold of documentation we had accumulated that would, if read with care, tell a different story. I felt the first inkling of how this would proceed, not with loud public spectacle, but with a patient surgical use of law and evidence to align truth and consequences. We were ready to move. We had the ER documents. We had video feeds labeled and archived. We had a suspect viral smear that would soon require a rebuttal, not of words, but of evidence. My phone buzzed with the name that would become a constant in the coming days. Mr. Caldwell. He was our counsel in matters that required a particular kind of tightness, the kind that leaves no loophole for theatrics. When Mr. Caldwell arrived, he wore his usual grey suit and an expression that specialized in being unbothered. He carried a leather folder. He read the ER report in my study with those grey eyes of his, then looked up and said, "This is the kind of clarity a court respects." He asked about the trust. When I mentioned Section 8, he nodded and pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "There is a clear path," he said, "but it will not run itself. Evidence chain, public posture, and timing. And you must be aware that they will push back, publicly, legally." "We were expecting pushback," Josephine said, her voice level as always. She put her hand on mine, a hand that had steadied me through decades of deals and losses. "Everything will be done within counsel," Mr. Caldwell said. "And we'll make sure the trustees act within their discretion. We will need to verify certain items, timestamps on footage, the certification of the ER report, originals of any relevant messages. The trust provides authority, but the court will require proof." "Do it," I said. "Lawful channels, documented steps. There is a particular dignity in moving through legal steps. It feels like planting stakes into the ground. Each signature and stamp is a declaration that you will not be cowed by spectacle." That night, as I signed a form allowing Marcus to release footage to our counsel, and as Mr. Caldwell photocopied the ER report for the file, I felt a certain cold comfort in bureaucracy. It is not applause, but it works. Late that night, as lanterns died across the city and the household settled into exhausted, suspicious reverie, I sat on our porch with Josephine. The night air tasted of damp pavement and distant traffic. There was a small moon over our estate, and the iron gate, a symbol of what we had guarded, glinted under its light. We did not speak much. There are some conversations where words are inadequate. She rested her head against my shoulder, and I thought of hands. How Josephine's hand had steadied presidents and financiers alike in the past. How it had been struck that evening like any private citizen's. I thought of her dignity, which was both fragile and unassailable. "Do you think he will come to us?" she asked quietly, meaning our son. "No," I said, and it was not a confident answer. I meant that I did not think the man who had chosen silence would find his way to the work of making amends unaided. Silence can calcify into habit. But that night was only the beginning. The legal and corporate work was a machine that runs on evidence, and we had begun to load it. Sometime just before dawn, my phone chimed. A small news outlet had picked up Sutton's clip and run it with a headline about a scandal at an elite wedding. The comments were like 1,000 small knives. But under the din, in the slow crawl of other, more careful observers, a question began to appear. Where were the medical reports and the full footage? Where was the full story? People ask for facts when the images grow murky. We would supply them with the deliberate slowness of those who prefer to win a war through logistics rather than theatrics. I tell you this, not because I want sympathy, but because I want to be clear about method. There is a moral argument embedded in what we did. Disrespect, especially public, coordinated disrespect against a woman whose life has been a partner to yours, must be answered with something more than outrage. It must be answered with truth that is bound up in law and medicine, because truth without proof is a story that the market of public opinion can easily buy or sell. And so our first moves were conservative in noise, but maximal in consequence. Secure the evidence, obtain the ER report, prepare counsel, and make sure that every step would be defensible in court or in public scrutiny. We would not be rushed into an emotional response that would weaken our position. The night after the wedding, as the city turned over and the lights of the estate blinked like tired eyes, I prepared for a different kind of fight, one that would unspool across depositions, press releases, and the stolidly slow world of legal calendars. Somebody would be tempted to describe what we were about to do as cold or vindictive. They did not understand that stewardship sometimes requires firmness. To preserve what had been entrusted to us required a coolness of mind and a generosity of purpose. To convert humiliation into restitution for those wronged, and if necessary, to reposition assets into structures that would secure community good rather than permit abuse. There are nights when you measure your life by the weight of your choices. On that porch, with Josephine's head on my shoulder and the file of the ER report at my side, I felt the balance tip toward action. It was an action not of vengeance, but of accountability and of consequence shaped by law, not lawlessness. In the morning, the public story would grow louder, campaigns would begin on both sides. Sutton's parents would seek counsel to defend their daughter. The internet would offer its chorus. I did not relish what was to come, but I was prepared. There is an odd comfort in being prepared. It keeps you from becoming the kind of man who chooses fury over justice. But some lines cannot be recrossed. There is a line between defending what is right and permitting those who would dishonor those you love to profit from their disrespect. When a slap reaches the face of your life companion in the space where you have invited a new family member into your home, it is not only a crime, it is a declaration about what that new family thinks of your wife and, by extension, of you. You cannot allow that declaration to stand. We had the footage, we had the ER report, we had witnesses, and we had a clause in a legal document that, if applied with caution and lawfulness, could sever a lineage of entitlement that had become corrupted by entitlement itself. That clause would not act now because of my whim. It would act because there was evidence sufficient to justify a trustee's discretion. The trustees, acting under counsel, would not be vindictive. They would be bound by fiduciary duty. They would be bound by facts and by the standard of proof necessary to alter distributions. As dawn crept up over the eastern tree line and the iron gates of our property gleamed in thin light, I could feel the world shifting. That slap had been the incision that would reveal more than one hidden condition of a marriage, of a son, of a family fortune. The incision exposed nerves, and nerves hurt. It also, if treated properly, allowed for corrective surgery. We were ready to begin that operation. We were ready to begin that operation. Morning brought the kind of cruel clarity that comes after shock. The headlines had multiplied overnight, and the first furious rounds of commentary arrived like hail against a window. Sutton's clip had been stitched into a narrative that favored drama over detail. Her parents' PR team did its work with the practiced speed of people who have always had others buy their stories. But our work was measured in paper and pixels, not in trending tags. Mr. Caldwell moved with a calm I've learned to mistake for indifference. He convened the trustees that same afternoon in our boardroom, a room I had watched be refitted over decades, each leather chair a small monument to an older, slower bureaucracy. The trustees gathered, a retired judge who had served on the family board for years, the bank's trust officer, and two family friends who had business acumen rather than blood. They sat like jurors, hands folded, eyes leveled. Mr. Caldwell laid the ER packet on the table and, as if he were reading scripture, quoted Section 8 aloud. Section 8, he read, shall permit the trustees, in their sole and reasonable discretion, to withhold, suspend, or redirect distributions to any beneficiary whose documented conduct has caused or is likely to cause demonstrable physical or psychological harm to the grantors. He tapped the page. The clause contemplates documented harm. What we have here, he said, eyes on me and then on Josephine, is a documented injury and an evidentiary trail. The trustees are empowered to act. He did not grandstand. He spoke like a man who had spent a lifetime converting words into consequence. Josephine listened without expression. Her hand found mine under the table the way it had in courtrooms and in kitchens. The retired judge cleared his throat and asked about proof. Chain of custody for the footage, certification for the ER report, original messages. Mr. Caldwell set a stack of thumb drives, stamped hospital copies, and printed text threads on the table like a small, damning snow. Everything here is certified, time-stamped, and backed up, he said. We will file a notice of potential forfeiture of distributions pending investigation and, given the grantor's instruction, we will exercise the trustee's discretion to suspend disbursements that would otherwise flow to the beneficiaries in question until this matter is resolved. The bank's trust officer nodded. Banks will comply with trustee determinations when proper authorizations and documentation are presented. We will restrict access to corporate lines and cancel any entitled credit that was provided at the trustee's behest. There was the practical language of limitation and the quiet violence of it. Cards cut, signatories revoked, access denied. It was lawful, surgical, exactly what I had in mind. We did not aim to humiliate for sport. The trustees executed their roles. Immediate suspension of discretionary distributions to Andre and to any accounts directly tied to Sutton's household. Revocation of any corporate cards issued in their names. Formal notice to our wealth manager to freeze discretionary transfers pending inquiry. These were the kinds of moves that required paperwork, signatures, and the cooperation of outsiders who insisted on legal architecture. They were the opposite of theater. They were ballast. At the same time, Mr. Caldwell advised that our next step was to hand the materials to detectives. You have to let criminal process run its course, he said. If you try to litigate in the court of public opinion, you give them the loud space. Let the prosecutors work on the facts. We give them the evidence, they do the work, and then we use the legal instruments at our disposal. He arranged a meeting with the lead detective assigned to the case. Detective Lang, call sign, arrived with two partners, a battering presence softened by years of paperwork. He had watched too many viral stories collapse into alleyways of rumor and was clearly relieved to find evidence that did not live in comments. We handed him the drives, the hospital copies with stamped signatories, and Marcus's chain of custody log. Marcus signed an affidavit confirming the integrity of the footage. The detective's pen moved quickly across the lines. There was a procedural dignity in the way he took custody. Evidence bags, seals, initials, a small ritual that converted pixels into proof. Medical documentation and surveillance together make a strong case, Detective Lang said quietly. If your witnesses are willing to testify, and if the lab corroborates the timestamps, we can pursue charges of simple assault and, depending on what else the investigation reveals, other counts as appropriate. He asked if Josephine would submit to an interview. She agreed, but insisted her words be concise. I want the facts on record, she told him. I do not need to be the center of spectacle. She provided a statement that recounted the event, the pain, the medical treatment, and the timeline. The forensic nurse's notes, photographs labeled and time-stamped, were certified and added to the file. The detective took photographs of Josephine's wounds, the handkerchief with locus of blood safely bagged and logged. Every item added weight. One of the small, decisive pieces came from an unlikely place, a bridesmaid who, in the immediate confusion, had recorded the post-slap exchange between Sutton and Spencer backstage. It was a short clip, but in it Sutton can be heard whispering something sharp, an edge not of surprise, but of preparedness. And Spencer, looking startled, nodding. It is a clip that would later play poorly for the defense. Marcus's hallway cam showed detail, the lean of Spencer's shoulder towards Sutton the minute before the event, and a split second of exchange. When detectives compared timestamps, the threads aligned. In that same week, a discreet discovery would prove pivotal. I had, earlier in the year, observed with an accountant's detachment that Richard and Evelyn Caldwell, no relation to our counsel, had leveraged their logistics company with thin margins and thin patience. A creditor's market exists for such paper, and in the grey rooms of private debt buying, one can purchase notes that are called distressed or toxic at a discount. I moved quietly, through intermediaries and legitimate channels, to acquire a number of outstanding notes tied to their holding company. The purpose was not personal malice, but to obtain leverage, to ensure there was a lawful means to hold them accountable if they used their privilege to cause harm that reached us. Let me be plain. Acquiring debt to gain leverage is an ordinary business practice and perfectly legal when done through proper intermediaries. It is not extortion. It is a form of creditor standing. Soon after the assault, those notes, unpaid and subject to certain covenants, became a tool in a lawful creditor's playbook when the debt became due. I will flag the specifics for counsel review. Verify legal. But the result was that Richard and Evelyn were suddenly parties with obligations they could not ignore. When their PR campaign bought sympathy but not solvency, and when their attempts to litigate threatened to bleed our resources, the creditor committee, of which I was one among many, though appropriately indirect, was within its rights to act when covenants were breached. But the financial maneuvers were sequenced deliberately behind the law enforcement actions. We had to keep our moral high ground clean. We could not be seen to be manufacturing a vendetta. The detectives needed to make the criminal case before anyone suggested that the financial pressure was a revenge scheme. Detective Lang's team moved with steady competence. They obtained warrants for Spencer's phone and for Sutton's devices. Forensics lab technicians extracted messages that, when printed and time-stamped, showed a pattern. There were fragments of text between Spencer and Sutton the day before. "It will be over quick. We'll make them look bad," and a late-night message from Spencer to Sutton. "Are you sure? You're certain you want to go through?" She replied, "Don't make me look weak. Tonight I decide." Those messages do not tell the whole story on their own, but combined with the hallway feed and the bridesmaid's video, they created a plausible narrative of coordination rather than an impulsive act of mutual heat. The prosecution would later frame it as evidence of intent and conspiracy to create a spectacle. When they served a warrant at Sutton's car, officers found a small bottle that field-tested positive for an illicit substance. That, coupled with a second charge, an allegation that came from her public misreporting of the event to media outlets, expanded the legal exposure. Arrest followed, and, carried along the ordinary path of criminal procedure, an arraignment, a grand jury decision to indict, and an eventual trial calendar. We had not sought to make the arrest ourselves. We had supplied the evidentiary bricks. The justice system had placed them. In the early weeks, the public wore out its outrage and replaced it with questions. Sutton's parents continued their media offensive, but the momentum shifted as more detailed information quietly leaked. The ER report, a statement from a bridesmaid, and the security logs. When the prosecution announced indictments, the online sympathizers began to quiet. The human thing people forget about mob sympathy is its fragility. Once evidence is introduced, sentiment can evaporate like fog. While detectives and prosecutors prepared their case, Mr. Caldwell moved the corporate pieces. He sought and obtained emergency orders from a civil court to restrict the use of certain corporate cards, and to require that any transfers above a modest threshold receive trustee approval. These were not permanent measures. They were temporary restraints justified by the ongoing nature of the investigation and by the trustee's obligation to preserve the grantor's well-being and estate. The bank cooperated when presented with the trustee's decision and the appropriate paperwork. Access to 2 penthouse suites in our city property was revoked. Keys ceased to function. Credit limits were lowered. Chauffeurs were reassigned. It is astonishing how quickly privilege can be hemmed in by good paperwork. Within 3 months, as criminal charges proceeded and as the trustees continued to exercise caution, the creditor play against Richard and Evelyn's company reached its operational phase. Their firm had obligations to lenders. When the day came for a covenant test, and it came with a tranche of unpaid receivables, the lender group I had joined through proxy voted to enforce the covenants. That yielded negotiations, and when those failed, legal actions followed. Notices of default, appointment of a receiver, and ultimately a court-supervised sale of key assets. The company was not taken in the cinematic sense. It was repurposed through the precise application of creditor rights. At the heart of the matter was not cruelty. It was accountability. Richard and Evelyn's family had dressed themselves in a narrative of grievance when, in truth, their position was financed by borrowed stability. When their firm's books failed to stand in court, balances mismatched, receivables overstated, the legal remedies available to creditors were exercised. The Manor, a building with more rooms than a small town, became collateral in an unfolding saga. It was not seized for spectacle. It was foreclosed upon in a lawful process that sorted debtors from creditors. At the public auction, an entity we formed, an Education and Community Development LLC, that I seeded through lawful donation, placed the winning bid. The funds were used to satisfy judgments and to create a platform for community investment thereafter. Again, verify with counsel, verify legal. But the result was an eviction of myth and the creation of purpose. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Sutton proceeded with careful choreography. The prosecution's opening was plain: show the chain of evidence, demonstrate intent, and let the jury see the physical and digital record of what had occurred. The ER photos were shown large and unflinching. The surveillance footage, DF2 and HS1, played side by side with the bridesmaid video in the court's projector. Spencer's messages were entered into evidence. The forensic nurse testified about the laceration and the timeline of treatment. Marcus testified about the security footage and the chain of custody logs. Josephine took the stand with the quiet dignity I have always loved, precise, resolute, not theatrical. The defense tried the theater of provocation and of misinterpretation. They argued that the clip had been taken out of context, that emotions had run high, and that Sutton had been provoked. They painted a picture of 2 women in conflict, both flawed, and asked the jury to forgive what they called a regrettable lapse in decorum. They suggested the hospital visit might have exaggerated appearance and that the public reaction had been disproportionate. The cross-examination was sharp and predictable. But the prosecution's theme, coordination, intent, and then the immediate unvarnished physical harm, held. The jury watched the slow scroll of timestamps and the consistent narrative they implied. It formed a connective tissue that stories spun on phones could not. Spencer, when called, offered a different kind of human failure. He was young and terrified. On the stand, he admitted to a pattern of messages and to a brief exchange with Sutton before the ceremony. His answers were halting. He said he had not intended for Josephine to be struck, that he had misjudged the tone of their planning, and that he had underestimated the cost of performance when pushed to the limits of a charged night. There was no heroism in his testimony, only the humility of someone who had become part of a narrative far larger than he had imagined. The jury's deliberation was not long. The combination of medical documentation, surveillance footage, recorded messages, and eyewitness testimony built a cohesive case. The verdict, guilty on assault and on the charge related to making a false statement to authorities, counts that carried meaningful sentences given the victim's age and the public nature of the offense. The judge in sentencing spoke of breach, not merely legal, but of trust and respect. Sutton was given a term that reflected the crime's gravity and was ordered to serve time along with mandated counseling. The court also imposed restitution and community service hours. It was not vindictive. It was consequential. I am not indifferent to the human cost of prison. I watched Sutton processed through the system and felt a current of complicated sorrow. We did not desire punishment for its own sake. We desired accountability and protection for Josephine and for the dignity of every person who had been invited into these rooms. The legal result ensured that the community could see that behavior has consequences and that privilege does not put a person above law. During and after the trial, public reaction shifted from shrill rumor to more reflective commentary. People began to see the edges of a more complicated tale. A son who did not stand, a family that had masked instability with old money charm, and two elders whose life's work had been threatened by a night of performance. The narrative moved from a single viral clip into a conversation about respect, entitlement, and the practical measures families must sometimes take to protect what is entrusted to them. Andre's role in all of this was perhaps the most painful. He did what he had been taught to do: avoid messy emotion and preserve the image of a family that, to his mind, must never be sullied. When the trustees exercised Section 8, and when his account access was cut, he initially called it injustice. His initial response was to cling to the comfortable narrative. He loved his wife, he supported her, and anyone who questioned that love was cruel. He spoke publicly, in interviews arranged by counsel, with the politeness of someone who had been coached. But the law and corporate mechanisms do not feed a man. They simply alter the circumstances in which he must live. Without access to certain funds, without the assumption of entitlement, Andre was forced to confront the hollow core of attitudes he had not been taught to test. He left the house, there is no sentimentalizing this, and moved to a modest borough apartment. For a time he drifted, angry and bewildered, blaming me and the trustees for what had happened. He blamed the law, and the evidence, and the world's appetite for spectacle. Then, as winters have a way of clarifying a man, humility arrived. He was not a prodigal in the melodramatic sense. He was a man forced to find a life where none had been required before. He found work with a friend of mine, an honest pro who ran a small construction crew and needed strong arms. Andre showed up once to learn how to lay rebar and to sweep a site. He was clumsy at first, his hands soft as fruit. Within weeks, they earned calluses. He learned the poetry of a daily wage, the rhythm of honest labor that does not require applause. It was not swift redemption. He made mistakes. He wrote to Josephine, at first furious, then contrite. She, in a gesture that was characteristic of her, replied with careful boundaries. A letter that spoke not of money, but of responsibility, of learning what it means to be a steward of more than oneself. Andre went to counseling, began therapy, and after a year of work and measured apology, started volunteering at the community site that had been formed from the manor's conversion. The repurposing of the manor was the part of this story that I take the most measured pride in. We did not seize the building to gloat. We used a lawful acquisition, structured through a court-supervised sale and a creditor settlement, to create a community asset. The manor's ornate ballrooms became classrooms. The servants' quarters were retrofitted into dormitories for students in need of housing during vocational training. The estate stables became workshops for trade programs. We formed a blind charitable trust with Mr. Caldwell and a panel of independent trustees to manage scholarships and to ensure there would be no familial favoritism. The trust's charter required transparency and an advisory board composed of community leaders. That was the point, to convert a symbol of exclusive privilege into an engine for public opportunity. We launched the Langston Josephine Community Institute with a modest ceremony, no chandeliers, only a portable stage, and a gathering of people who had been on the margins of the city's benevolence for too long. Children who had lived in neighborhoods far from the corridors of power were given first preference for vocational scholarships. We set up a bursary for women returning to work after caregiving gaps. The estate's library, formerly a private retreat of rare volumes, was opened as a public resource. The intent was the opposite of revenge. It was restitution magnified. What had been a shrine to exclusivity was now a place that taught skills and offered mentorship. There was resistance, of course. Richard and Evelyn decried the theft in press statements mediated by counsel and by a few friends who had a talent for righteous rhetoric. They alleged procedural improprieties that were, by and large, addressed in court filings and, where substantive, corrected through lawful process. They found in public humiliation certain perverse satisfaction, but it was waning. The community began to report that the workshops were full, that kids once idle had something meaningful to do, and that the long rooms that once hosted parties were now filled with study and hands-on labor. Andre, when he first walked those converted halls, did not receive a hero's welcome. He was anonymous among the men putting down flooring and welding handrails. He learned humility where it could not be polished away. Sometimes he would pass by the classrooms and stand at the doorway, watching a woman show teenagers how to read a blueprint. Once, he sat with a group of students repairing a broken stair. A 12-year-old looked up at him and asked bluntly, "Why do you work here if you have money?" He had no easy answer. He said, "Because I need to learn that money isn't a shield." It was clumsy and honest. There are things money cannot buy. Repentance, earned trust, the slow labor of rebuilding character. Andre's path back would not be total or guaranteed. He made amends where he could, and that began with steady work and patient listening. He also began to attend family meetings that were less about finances and more about the underlying values that had once guided us: responsibility, respect, and stewardship. Those meetings were sometimes hard. Old grievances are not undone by a contractor's skill. But they were real. As for Sutton, her sentence included an element I insisted upon not out of malice, but out of a belief in remediation. Required counseling and community service in institutions that serve the elderly and vulnerable. The court's aim, a combination of punishment and rehabilitation, was to prevent the young woman from hurting others in the future. I do not pretend to know what prison does to a person at the deepest levels. I only know that a system that couples accountability with opportunities for change is preferable to spectacle without consequence. The weeks and months that followed were full of small administrative triumphs and quiet griefs. We rebuilt some things and accepted that others were lost. Reputation, once splintered, can be repaired, but not returned to a former gloss. Josephine's grief lingered in a hush that sometimes fell over our breakfast table when she would look at a chair an extra place and remember the son who had not stood. There are losses a dollar amount cannot reconcile. We spoke of them plainly, of the sorrow of betrayal and the necessity of consequence. We also sought to preserve something I had learned in my early years. Wealth is a responsibility to a web of people whose livelihoods are not flashy but essential. Foremen who had built our apartments, school teachers whose salaries were supplemented by our grants, single parents supported by scholarship funds, all of them were on our mind when we repurposed the manor and when we restructured the trust. We converted a portion of our holdings into a blind charitable trust designed to fund education and public infrastructure without the stalest artifacts of family meddling. The trustees were given bylaws, oversight, and the authority to act in ways that prioritized mission over lineage. There is a certain justice in that. One generation's excess becomes the next generation's opportunity. On quiet evenings, after the press cycles had dwindled and the legal calendars had their first pockets of calm, Josephine and I would walk the paths of the repurposed gardens. The estate's iron gates now open to a busier kind of traffic. Students in backpacks, tutors carrying boxes of textbooks, volunteers bringing tools. Once, an old neighbor, a woman who had lost a son to addiction, stopped us and said, "You turned that house into a place that saved my boy." Those are the small reports that do more to salve an old man's conscience than any public statement. It would be dishonest to say that I felt no satisfaction. I felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan that had worked as intended. Dignity asserted, law followed, restitution established. But satisfaction was tempered by the memory of the slap. Its sound had lodged in me like a stone. There was no glee in another's fall. There was relief in a writing. As for Andre, there came a day when he arrived at the Community Institute and, with a nervous but steady voice, asked if he could teach a workshop on project management for the older apprentices. He had learned, in scaffolding and coffee breaks and on-site mistakes, practical skills that could be taught. He organized his first class nervously, then with growing confidence. And when the heads of apprentices turned to look at him with respect, he seemed to understand a different way to be a man of consequence, by creating value rather than by inheriting it. The public narrative softened. People gradually traded sensational interest for the more useful conversation we had hoped to engender. What does respect mean in a world of inherited privilege? How do you craft systems that prevent harm and that require responsibility? We did not claim to have all the answers. We claimed instead to have applied a set of principles. Evidence matters, law matters, and the stewardship of wealth requires both firmness and charity. The final legal raps came in slow stages. Civil suits filed by Sutton's family against us for allegations of defamation were dismissed or settled on terms that reflected the evidentiary reality. We had not lied. The creditor actions led to restructuring agreements that satisfied creditors and created long-term funding for the Institute. The trustees' decisions, Section 8 invoked, accounts suspended, were supported by the court where challenged. Again, details of legal mechanism ought to be reviewed by counsel, verify legal, but the arc was clear. Lawful procedure, evidence-supported consequences, and community redirection. One autumn night, a year after the wedding, the Institute hosted a modest gala to mark its first graduating class from the vocational program. There were no crystal chandeliers now, only strings of bulbs and a hungry, honest crowd. Josephine stood and, handing a young woman a certificate, smiled in a way that had nothing of the old triumph. It was a smile of purpose. I watched from the edge of the room, feeling something close to peace. We had altered the course of several lives. For Sutton, consequences. For Andre, an enforced humility and an opportunity to earn trust. For Richard and Evelyn, a legal reckoning for choices they had made in leveraging borrowed prestige. For Josephine and me, a redefinition of legacy, not a vault, but a vessel. There is a final bar to this tale that cannot be ignored. Grief. In the weeks after the trial, I sometimes caught myself bereft, not for the loss of money, but for the loss of a simpler faith in human loyalty. There is no law that repairs the quiet ache of a son's silence. There is only time, contrition, and the slow rebuilding of a relationship in deeds rather than declarations. On the porch, where the story had pivoted months earlier, Josephine and I sat again as a wind moved through the hedges. The iron gate shone in the dusk, now serving buses and backpacks instead of dividers. We held hands the way people who have traveled long roads together do, without announcement, with a mutual reserve that is its own language. She leaned on my shoulder and said, "We did what we had to do." We did, I agreed. There are lessons in this that are blunt and others that are soft. Respect is not merely a feeling. It is a boundary. It is enforced by the small, patient things, by signatures, by cameras, by medical charts, by the sober work of administrators who know how to turn words into action. Privilege without accountability invites decay. Power exercised without restraint invites spectacle. But the most important lesson to me has been this. When dignity is struck in public, the proper response is not a bloodying of hands, but the assembling of facts, and the insistence that justice be measured, not shouted. If you had been in that room, if you had heard the slap and felt the stunned silence, what would you have done? I asked that 2 months ago, and I'm still reading your answers. They matter to me because they reveal how people think about courage and custody of their own stories. I do not claim that our path would succeed for every family. I cannot promise that every moral affront will find equal redress. But in this case, backed by evidence, routed through proper channels, and tied to a broader conversion of assets for public good, we found a way to answer a public humiliation with institutional consequence. We closed the manor's main ballroom to the old parties and opened it to night classes. The chandeliers survived, not as trophies, but as luminous fixtures above sewing machines and welding stations. The marble that had once borne the bruise was repurposed into a memorial plaque that listed the Institute's founding principle: dignity through opportunity. Andre called me one evening after his 3rd week teaching. "I'm tired," he said, "but I feel useful." His voice was raw but steadier than it had been. I did not say, "I told you so." I did not want to teach him that lesson. I said, "Then keep going." There is a quietness to these last pages that feels fitting. We did not seek revenge. We sought redress. We converted humiliation into a source of public good. We enforced boundaries in ways the law permits and the conscience supports. We tightened the trust's governance so that future generations would not be able to undo what stewardship requires. And we watched, with a wary but growing solace, as the community grew healthier for it. At night, when the porch is cool and Josephine sleeps inside, I find myself reflecting on hands. The hands that struck, the hands that steadied, the hands that signed documents, the hands that now teach trades. Hands are instruments of harm and of repair. What we did with ours was to bind them to a purpose larger than inheritance, to make sure that respect is not a currency you can counterfeit with charm, but a standard you earn with behavior. If you believe, as I do, that respect must be earned and protected, tell me why below. Share this story with someone who needs to see the difference between spectacle and consequence. If you want more stories about what accountability looks like in practice, about power that chooses restraint and stewardship that chooses justice, please like and subscribe.